Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how to draw a horse in pastels and how to get detail when working on a larger scale. So first up for me, after I do the background, is the eye. Now the one thing that I really did enjoy about this portrait is because I was working on a larger scale, I was able to get so much detail and the reflections in the eye that I just wouldn't be able to achieve when working on a smaller scale. So you can see here that I can even draw the person reflecting in that eye who's taken the photograph. So working larger, although it does take time and we must allow that extra time for this size, it really does pay off when we're trying to get more realism in our work. So with horse eyes, there are a lot of little wrinkles and creases around the eye that I want to make sure that I get right. So my first tip when drawing any wrinkles, and this would be on people's skin as well, is you want to make sure that you've got a nice transition. So look at those creases at the bottom of the eye, you've got a dark shadow and then a highlight, but there is always going to be a darker mid-tone in between. You don't want to just draw one dark line and then one white harsh line. You must have that nice gradual smooth transition between the two, and that's going to help to build up that 3D shape of that crease. There is no wrinkle that's just going to show as a harsh line. There's always going to be a slightly softer edge, and that is going to depend on your light source. So once I built up the main foundations around the eye, it's still not quite finished, but it's about 80% there. I started mapping in the base layers around the face. Now, as I did this portrait a couple of years ago, I'm actually using my sanded soft pastel stick method. Now I've switched over to using my pan pastels just because it's easier to mention those specific colours that I'm using in the tutorials. Now the sanded soft pastel stick method works really well, and you don't have to therefore invest in pan pastels if you don't want to at that time. If you have some soft pastel sticks lying about but you do like to apply them as I have done here in a nice soft blended way, then just lightly sand those down with a bit of fine grit sandpaper and they will work just the same as pan pastels. Now pan pastels I find have a few other advantages compared to soft pastel sticks, and I do talk about that in my Patreon tutorials. Everything there is significantly slower, most of the time they're in real time, so if they're of interest I'll link my Patreon in the description below. So once I've put my base layer down, I then work on a layer of refinement. Now the layer of refinement for me is a crucial layer. One of the questions that I'm often asked is, how do I get my details with pastels looking so smooth and you can't see the grain of the paper showing through? And that's in the layering process. If you skip out layers underneath and jump straight into your details, you will end up with that grainy look. So again, this is something that I focus specifically on in my slower tutorials, how we build up the layers to end up with nice smooth details. So when it comes to building up this fur here, you can see that I'm working from dark to light. I've made sure that my base layer was dark enough, and therefore I've worked with really good contrast early on, and then I'm gradually building up my layers working from dark to light. Now something that can happen is if you don't have your base layer dark enough, your details will look like they're not as bright. And it's a good indication then when that happens that you do need to go back over, darken up that base layer and start those detailed layers again. Now alternatively, if you don't want to do that, you can go back in with your darker pencils and add in some of those darker details. But usually darkening up the entire base layer is just going to give you more depth overall. Now if that happens and you do realise that the base layer isn't dark enough, you usually will notice that early on. So when you first start doing that initial layer of detail and you start indicating it that fur direction, it's then that you'll notice it. So it's not like you'll get to this stage here where I am and then think, no, it's not right, it's not dark enough, I'm going to have to start it over and then go back over with a darker base layer. So if you do notice that early on and it's making you question whether or not your base layers are dark enough, it's probably not. So at that stage I'd recommend to go in and darken it up slightly. So one of the more challenging parts of any horse portrait are going to be the ears and the forelock. So that's the part of the mane that's in between both ears. It usually drapes over across the eyes, and at that point you're going to have quite a lot of texture. Now as with the face, again I've worked from dark to light. I'm really focusing on my fur direction. Now I have a video here on YouTube and it's my top tips for drawing realistic fur with pastels. If that's of interest, I'll link that in the description below. One of those things there I say about is fur direction. Now this takes so much of an importance with any subject regardless of the animal that I'm drawing. You want to make sure that you're following that really closely because that's going to adjust what that animal looks like. The fur direction, especially with horses because they have quite short coats, is that any of that fur direction that does shift and does change is being there for a reason. So it's indicated at that underlying bone and muscular structure. Because horses do have many additional muscles, they've got some of the veins, the little foundations under the skin, all of that is going to make the fur direction shift. So I have to make sure that I get that accurate early on. So now that I've got more of this in place, you can really see just how much the fur details are shifting. The fur lock there above the eye, that highlights they are curving sometimes down towards the lower right corner, whilst others are aiming towards the left side of the portrait. It's having this variation here that's going to build up the depth. However, the most important thing is that we make sure that we're building up this depth in the right layer. The way that we order these layers is really important. If we order them in the incorrect way, it's just going to have more of a two-dimensional feel. And again, this is why I break everything down on my Patreon tutorials into individual layers. Noticing at what point the fur is at that layer is going to make it much easier to get that realistic look in our portrait. If we try to draw what's on top of the fur first and then work our way down, we're working backwards. We want to be leaving those details last, focusing on everything that's closest to the skin and working up from there. So before we move on to the rest of this portrait, if the tips and techniques that I've shared so far have been useful, I would really appreciate it if you could give the video a like and a thumbs up because it makes a huge difference. I also upload content 2 to 3 times a week, so if you'd like to get notified of that content, then hit the subscribe and the bell button. Now again, back to my base layers. I put so much focus on this on my tutorials because they do really make a difference. These are the base foundations for our details. So I personally want to make sure that I've got that layer nice and soft, it's well blended. I don't want to apply too much pigment either because filling the tooth of the paper early on will massively limit how many detailed layers you can put on top. Now this is one of the more common complaints that pastels can get, and it will ultimately depend on how you use that first base layer. The paper that you use as well is also really important. The paper that I like to use is Pastelmat by Clairefontaine, and it allows for many layers to be applied. But even that, in making sure you're working with a good paper, you do still have to be very considerate of the amount of pastel you're applying for that base layer. If ever you feel that your pencils are just gliding over the top of your base layer, that's usually a good indication that you have filled the tooth of the paper. You've got a couple of options. You can try to remove that pastel so that you can then work back with your pastel pencils. You can try using some softer brands of pastel pencils that will hopefully try to put a bit more of an opaque layer over the top. Something like the Derwent and the Caran. They are a little bit softer, more opaque. So where the Pitt pastels may not grip to that because they're a bit more of a harder lead, you still might be able to get one more layer with the softer leaded pencils on those areas where you have filled the tooth of the paper. Now in some cases like here, you can see just how many layers I'm adding. There is an awful lot. If you have filled the tooth of the paper, you won't be able to get this amount of detail. You could apply a workable fixative, spray that over the top, wait for it to dry, and that should then put enough tooth of that paper back for you to get back up to those details and the level of realism that you want. Now the one thing though with using a workable fixative is do bear in mind that they can adjust the colour and your tonal values of your artwork. So I would personally never recommend to use it if you're nearer to completion with that portrait. However, you don't want to have to start that portrait again, and if it's technically not finished and you have to go over and add a little bit more layer to get that colour adjustment back to how it was before you applied that fixative, then that may be the better option. But that is just something to be aware of, and what I would definitely recommend is to use light layers of a fixative. Don't go in with one heavy layer because that can potentially ruin that artwork. I would definitely use a bit of a scrap experimental piece to start with so you can get confident with applying that fixative before you do it on your project. So when it comes to horse muzzles and their noses, I want to make sure that I've got the shape of the nostril right. Just like with any dog or cat portrait, any other animal, if the nostrils are in the wrong position or they're in the wrong, they've got the wrong shape or anything like that, it can really draw the viewer's eye to that. It's very noticeable. So the first thing I would always do is map in the shape of that nostril first. Use that as your main reference point. The rest of that around that nose is going to then be easier to judge. What I then usually do is once I've got the nose and the muzzle in, I'm starting to now bridge up the fur between the middle portion of the face and the nose itself. I just find that this is a bit easier to judge that fur direction when you know where that fur gradually tapers off and where the nose and the muzzle begins. And this also really highlights just how many tonal values I have here. Now the tonal values are in relation to how many lights and how many darks you've used of that colour. So you can see I've got a lot of creams, I've got a lot of lighter yellows, some light browns, some pinks. All of these here are playing a really important role of capturing that light source. So I'm just starting to add those final details here, and the last thing that goes on any of my portraits are the whiskers. Now horses do tend to have a lot of eyelashes and those whiskers around the nose and the muzzle, so I want to make sure that I've included those, but I do want to leave those till those last layers, purely because, as I've said, they do overlap everything else. If you draw those in too early on, we're then going to have to draw around them when we go back, add in the hair and the fur. So I do hope this video has been useful. If you would like to see how I layer and all of the other things that I've mentioned here in this video, then my Patreon tutorials may be of interest. I'll link that in the description below, and if you've got any questions, anything art related, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help. And as I've said, if you could give this video a thumbs up, a like, it makes a huge difference and YouTube will share it with more people. As always, thank you so much for watching.